We live in a world of opposites. And if you take a quick look at the world around you, it doesn't take much to see the truth in this. From the tiniest bits of elementary matter, all the way up to the forces that hold together whole galactic systems, opposites rule supreme. Additionally, we see this dynamic play at work in things such as the weather, as well as in the world of politics, just to give a couple amongst the various examples where we see in both nature and society. That is, this idea of opposites is the very pattern that moves and shapes the world we live in. Well, unsurprisingly, we see a very similar form of operation at work in the early church as well. And it is for this very reason that we will be examining this history in the following manner. Now, from our last discussion, you may remember a chart summarizing many of the early Christological heresies. And on this chart, I'd like to direct your attention specifically to two groups on the very fringes. Now, what is most interesting is here we have two belief systems that are in effect, as you can see, complete opposites of each other. And so perhaps for this very reason, you might be wondering, why put two groups so diabolically opposed to one another into one video? Well, really, the pure irony here is that it is this very extremity of difference that makes them so similar. Case in point is for the very fact just mentioned, that they both stood on the very fringes of what one might call Christian. That is, they are similar in that both are equally, from an Orthodox perspective, extremely heretical. That is, in contrast to the rest of the heresies on this chart, which are more or less mildly heretical in comparison. Additionally, if we examine the dates again, we'll notice that both seem to fall within a similar time period, beginning perhaps sometime in the late 1st, early 2nd century, and flourishing throughout much of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, respectively. Now, it must be noted that we don't have exact dates on these two groups like we do for, say, some of the other groups on this chart, which really leads into yet another close similarity between these two groups in that we don't have a lot of exact anything with regard to either one, simply because much about what we know about them is really shrouded within a great deal of mystery. In fact, we don't even know if there were groups adhering to the following names. Now, what we do know, however, is that there were in fact members confessing much of what will be discussed in this video. But much of what will be discussed is most likely a lumping together of various groups with similar ideas. One way to think of the Ebionites and the Docetists would be similar to how one might use one label to refer to what is effectively a whole landmass of various ethnicities. So for example, when we refer to someone as being Asian or African or European, we are really effectively lumping together whole masses of people groups, each containing amongst themselves quite a deal of diversity from one another, into one group. Well, in a similar way, when we refer to Ebionites or Docetists, we're really dealing with a similar phenomenon here. That is, when we are referring to these two groups, we're really dealing with two whole land masses of people, each containing amongst themselves a great deal of diversity. Or perhaps another analogy that is even more closely related would be to think of the Ebionites and Docetists in relation to the monotheists of today. However, as many of us are well aware, when we speak of monotheists, what can be classified as one group in fact works out to be a group containing within itself several subgroups, such as Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, each of which containing within themselves their own unique specificities that differentiate themselves from one another. And so it'll be very important to bear this in mind as we examine these groups. Nevertheless, like whole continents, and like monotheistic religions, there seems to be core elements here that unified these two groups as a whole. And this leads us into perhaps what is the greatest area of similarity regarding their dissimilarity. That is, the core characteristics defining each group. And perhaps the most defining characteristic was how each of these groups viewed Jesus' nature. So on the one hand, the Ebionites viewed Jesus as a human. And by that I mean they fully accepted all that being a human entails, in that he was born, died, suffered, and so forth, really much like any other human would. That is, Jesus was, in every respect, fully human, period. Now the reason I say period is because the Ebionites fully rejected the divinity of Jesus. That is, anything resembling hints of divinity, whether it be pre-existence or the Immaculate Conception, were denied by them. Now, there were some Ebionites, supposedly, who would have accepted his resurrection from the dead. But those who did accept it did not view it as a sign of divinity. On the other hand, the Docetists fully embraced Jesus' divinity. Now, how they understood that divinity might have differed from mainstream orthodoxy, but nevertheless they accepted Jesus as divine. However, in contrast to the Ebionites, the Docetists rejected anything human in Jesus. That is, Jesus was not born. Jesus did not die, and most importantly, Jesus did not suffer or anything of the sort. Now, if you are familiar with the life of Jesus, you might be wondering how any of this is even remotely possible, being that the Gospels testify about all of it, really. Well, the Docetist answer would simply be, well, that's because he appeared to do these things, but in actual fact, he didn't. It was all smoke and mirrors. In fact, this is where the group's name originates, from the Greek word dokeo, meaning to appear or seem. That is, he walked, but didn't leave footprints. And really the reason for this rejection of Jesus' humanity pivots on the docetic rejection of the suffering Christ on the cross. Now again, you might be wondering how the Docetists get around this. Generally speaking, the process of crucifixion can be a quite unpleasant process, to say the least. So you might be wondering how any of this was an appearance. Well, the Docetists had a very clever way of getting around this. They would say that at the very last second, right before Jesus was crucified, he had a second guy who looked just like him take his place. And that guy was crucified. That is, essentially, Jesus had something like a stunt double to take the blows for him. Meanwhile, while this guy is being tortured to death, Jesus is up in heaven laughing at him. Now, earlier we mentioned that the Ebionites rejected the divinity of Jesus. Well, to get the answer to this question, we really have to look at yet another defining characteristic of the Ebionites. And that was that the Ebionites were everything Hebrew. That is, Jesus was a Hebrew Messiah, according to the Hebrew Scriptures, Torah and Prophets, sent by the Hebrew God of Israel for the Hebrews. That is, not the Gentiles, which we shall discuss shortly. And therefore, being Hebrew, the Ebionites also upheld what is perhaps the most central tenet of Hebrewness, the Shema, which reads, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." The Ebionites claimed that if you uphold this verse, then you must consequently also reject Jesus' divinity. For if Jesus is divine, then we have two gods, not one, hence contradicting the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4. On the other hand, if the Ebionites could be described as everything Hebrew, then perhaps the Docetists could be described as everything not Hebrew. That is, they rejected the God of the Old Testament as well as the Scriptures associated with him. Which really leads into our third point as to what writings these groups considered scripture. As was just mentioned, the Ebionites upheld the Torah and prophets of the Old Testament to be authoritative in every respect, following the Hebrew laws to the letter as good, obedient Hebrews. In fact, this is actually what the Ebionites considered salvation, being obedient to the scriptures. And so this idea of a gospel of salvation by grace alone, offered to all nations, Jew and Gentile alike, was thoroughly rejected by the Ebionites. And therefore the Apostle Paul, as well as anything written by him, was likewise also rejected by the Ebionites. In fact, much if not all of the New Testament scriptures were rejected, with the possible exception of Matthew's gospel, redacted to take out any references to divinity. And if you read through Matthew's gospel, you begin to quickly see why this is. On the flip side, the Docetists, while fully rejecting the Old Testament, fully embraced the Apostle Paul and all that he wrote. Now, apart from Paul's writings, the remainder of the New Testament was largely ignored or even rejected by Docetists, with the possible exception of a redacted version of Luke's gospel. I say redacted because the Docetists edited out any Old Testament reference. And this brings us to our fourth and final point with regards to the polarized differences between the two camps: salvation. Now, being that salvation plays a large role in the Christian faith, it might be worthwhile to briefly examine how each of these groups viewed the matter. Now, earlier we mentioned that the Ebionite was everything Hebrew. However, part of being Hebrew meant faithful obedience to the law of Moses and the prophets. And it is in the life of Jesus of Nazareth that the Ebionites found their ultimate source of inspiration in accomplishing this task. Simply because it is Jesus, we see, who perfectly followed the law to the letter over the course of his life. For there was not a flaw to be found in his character. He was in essence the ideal human. In fact, it was due to this perfect observation of the law that Jesus, in effect, qualified as the Messiah. Therefore, being perfect in this respect, Jesus served as the ideal example of how the Ebionite also ought to live out their daily life. Hence, salvation was not an act of grace performed by Jesus for humanity, but rather something that humanity must attain to. This attainment was possible only through faithful obedience to the law. That is, it was by works, not grace, that one could be saved. Rather than a salvation that inevitably leads to obedience to the law, as upheld by Orthodox Christians, it was an obedience to the law that led to salvation. However, part of being a faithful, obedient observer of the law involved many of the difficulties one would face in this world. As Jesus in one of his sermons states, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And it was for this very reason that the Ebionites derived their name. That is, from the Hebrew Aramaic root meaning poor or needy. The Ebionites believed that if they were faithful to the end, they would receive their allotted inheritance as promised by their Messiah, in spite of all the circumstances that were thrown at them in life. And finally, the salvation that we see offered is not something offered to all mankind, but more specifically to the Hebrew people alone. And therefore, in order to attain to this salvation, required that one first become a Jew through the process of circumcision. However, for the Docetists, salvation had less to do with works and more to do with knowledge. That is, salvation was not something done, but something known. Not deeds, but truth. Not acting, but thinking. Not attainment, but enlightenment. Now, how knowledge related to salvation, we shall discuss more in depth in the following video. Now, the church is going to respond to these groups by both simultaneously accepting as well as rejecting much of what they had to say. And this is simply because both were emphasizing things, all of which the church considered vitally important to the Christian faith, and also consequently rejecting things the church considered vitally important to the Christian faith. For example, with regards to Jesus' nature, the church would respond by affirming both the humanity of Christ as well as his divinity, and that to neglect either one or the other would be detrimental to one's salvation. As concerns the Hebrew elements of the Christian faith, the church would come to see the fundamental importance that such elements played in a proper and adequate understanding both of the person of Jesus as well as much of the Christian faith as a whole. And with regards to Scripture, rather than accepting either the Old Testament or the New Testament, the church would come to accept both the Old Testament and New Testaments. And rather than rejecting either Matthew or Luke, the early church would come to accept both Matthew and Luke. And finally, concerning salvation, the church would emphasize the importance of grace as manifest in the works of Jesus' sacrifice for humanity, yet nevertheless upholding a grace that produces a life of faithful obedience to the law. In fact, it's really in view of groups such as these that we begin to see the emergence of two ideas around this time. Something of a canon of Scripture and an idea known as apostolic succession. And it's really in this context, that is the context of such groups, with such extreme doctrines as these, that the church is going to formulate such ideas in response. And therefore, in order to steer the Christian faith in the right direction, the church is going to put down parameters more strictly defining the Christian gospel and central teachings. And on that note, it might help to give a brief explanation of these two ideas here. Now, there seems to be a common misunderstanding with regards to the dating on the canonicity of the New Testament. Many have made the claim that the New Testament canon was an invention of the late 4th century, based on the fact that it was around this time that the canon was officially finalized. Well, in order to adequately explain what is happening here, allow me to use an analogy that I've mentioned in a previous video of mine that I shall present here. An analogy that I feel probably best explains this is the two terms maximum law that a president can serve in office. Now, suppose someone asks, how far back into history does this idea of two terms maximum law in office go? However, when we ask this question, it is important that we clarify what we mean by it. Now, really, there are two possible ways to ask this question. Number one, how long has the two terms of office been a practice carried out by presidents? Or two, how long has the two terms of office been an official law? Because, truth be told, the answers between these two questions differ by about a century and a half. Now, for many who are acquainted with this story will know that while the law itself wasn't officially put into force until the 20th century, the idea itself was nevertheless an unquestioned practice upheld and carried out by every president going back to Washington in the 18th century up to that point in time. There was really no need for a law simply because everyone assumed, in democratic style, that it was the right thing to do. So then, this being the case, why then would Congress suddenly decide to make a law about some century and a half later? The answer is simply because someone came along and violated the principle. Now, in all fairness, the U.S. at that time was going through a series of crises. What with the Depression and then later World War II. And so perhaps due to this crisis, Americans saw the need to keep this particular man in office longer. And remember, there was no official law barring it up to this point in time. So technically, that particular president wasn't violating any official laws. Nevertheless, Congress made a law prohibiting this practice from that point on. Now just imagine if someone who doesn't know U.S. history that well made the claim that the 2 terms of office rule was just some idea that originated in the middle of the 20th century, merely based on the fact that such a law came into effect at that time. And in a very similar fashion, the New Testament canon of the late 4th century onward was merely a final clarified redaction of those New Testament books that had been assumed by the early church from its very inception. Likewise, it is in the 2nd century that we really begin to see this process of a more clarified canon of Scripture begin to take effect. And as in the analogy of the 22nd Amendment, the reason for such need of a canon was a response to bad teachings and bad canons. And when I say bad canons, I mean that both the Ebionites as well as the Docetists had adopted canons of their own, specifying which books were true. For example, as was mentioned earlier, the Ebionites created a canon that, as far as we know, consisted of the Old Testament as well as a redacted version of the Gospel of Matthew. Likewise, the Docetists adopted a canon that entirely rejected the Old Testament, yet possessed a New Testament canon consisting of 11 books, 10 of which from the Apostle Paul, as well as a redacted Gospel of Luke. And so in order to faithfully protect the message and teachings of the Christian faith, the church had to put down a canon distinguishing right books from wrong ones. A second idea used by the early church to safeguard the Christian gospel and teachings was an idea known as apostolic succession. Apostolic with regards to those teachings and version of the gospel as taught by the original apostles. Succession with regards to the process or means by which this original teaching was conveyed, and that was via the succession of bishops. That is, apostolic succession is the process by which the traditions and core central teachings of the early apostles were faithfully passed on from one generation to the next by means of a succession of bishops. Therefore, those churches who could trace their line of bishops back to the original apostles themselves were the true church, as opposed to those who couldn't. However, in order to really understand and appreciate why such an idea came into existence, requires an adequate understanding of the context in which such an idea emerged. And that context, as has been just discussed, is the context of extreme heretical groups such as, for example, the Ebionites or the Docetists. That is, apostolic succession, like a canon of Scripture, was adopted by the early church as a safeguard against false gospels, and therefore served the function of distinguishing the true church from that which was not. Hence, such a succession of bishops was not the end in and of itself, so much as the means to that end. And therefore apostolic succession could be translated to mean those churches which followed in line with the original central teachings of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, the church would never again return to such extremes as were embodied by either the Ebionites or the Docetists. However, while the church will never embrace such views from this point on, it is really such views that will aid in setting the boundary markers of the theological discussion in the church. Because, as we shall see, over the course of the next few centuries, the church is going to find itself in a back and forth struggle of theological pong in an attempt to balance these two natures of Christ. What is more is the irony of the fact that the very extremeness of such heresies on both fronts that initially threatened the integrity of the gospel will be the very factor that safeguards its orthodoxy. I invite all questions and comments in the discussion section, so please feel free to write or ask any questions below. Thanks.